Hi guys, it's Angie with Fun Endeavors Tie-Dye Lab. Today I'm going to experiment and try a new technique for gravity dye. This one I'm going to do 3 diagonal lines on a shirt and I'm going to tie them with sinew. I've never done this one before, but I thought it would be a fun experiment to try. So the very first thing I'm doing is I'm drawing some diagonal lines on my shirt using a straight edge and a washable marker. I'm going to do my very first line on the shirt and then I'm going to try to space them evenly from that initial line. I'm measuring from the seam of the sleeve over to the neck of the shirt and I'm going to do my first line just about in the middle of that section. So I'm starting the line there and I'm ending it at the corner of the hem of the shirt. Then from here, this is a size 2X shirt. How far your distance is between the lines will depend upon the size shirt you're using. I wanted to try this design and I thought a size 2X would probably be a good size to try. The shirt is large enough that I can get a little bit of space between the different lines. So I'm just measuring, placing my lines in equal distance from that center line, and then I'm going to draw 2 straight lines for those diagonal lines. Now I'm going to accordion fold each one of the lines and I'm going to start with the center line. Once I have the line folded, I'm going to tie it with some sinew. Sinew has a wax coating, and the wax coating on the artificial sinew I'm using will help to keep this line white. In other words, it's going to make a definition line on the shirt because the dye is not going to be able to get underneath this line. So this part of the shirt is going to remain white. What I'm doing is I'm wrapping the sinew around the line a couple of times. Then I'm going to gently start to pull it. As I'm pulling it, I'm taking my other hand and pressing down because my line is pretty long and I want to make sure that it doesn't buckle. I turn the shirt over and it's doing well. In other words, if your line of folds is too long and you start to just pull that sinew really tight, what can happen is the line can fold in on itself, kind of like a taco does. And I don't want that because then it causes a gap in the sinew and the dye can get under that area. Once I have the first line tied, I'm going to cut off my sinew and I'm going to fold and tie the next 2 lines the same exact way. For this shirt, I've chosen 3 colors, and I'm using Mindbender X as my main color, so I chose a couple colors that I thought would look really good with Mindbender X. So I'm using Forest Green and Brilliant Blue from Dharma. For my setup, I have 2 plastic sawhorses, and then in between the sawhorses, I've placed 3 pieces of vinyl guttering. And I've turned the vinyl guttering upside down so that the flat side is on top. And then I've placed the sinew lines right on top of each one of the pieces of guttering. I'm leaving a gap between the pieces of guttering because I want the shirt in between each one of those sinew lines to kind of dip down into that area. The goal for this shirt is to place each one of the colors right on the sinew line, and then for the dye to flow down each side, and hopefully the colors will meet close to the middle. That's at least the goal. So I placed Mindbender X from Dye Spin right on the middle sinew line, Forest Green on one of the other ones, and Brilliant Blue on the third line. Then I placed a little bit of dry soda ash over the top of each one of the dye lines and a piece of ice over the dye. And the ice that I'm using is just a larger chunk of ice, which I made in a dip container. It takes a little while longer for these ice cubes to melt, and I think it works better when I do the gravity dyes outside to use these larger pieces of ice. I've included some photos of what the shirt looked like as the ice melted and the dye ran through the shirt. And after this first layer of ice melted, some of the dye had dissolved and flowed through the shirt, but not all of it. So I added another layer of ice. And then after that second layer of ice melted, it started to get dark and it looked kind of like it was going to rain. So I went ahead and brought the shirt inside, but I wasn't happy with the dye flow. I still had way too much white left on the shirt and my dye was really blotchy. So I decided to try to see if I could maybe add a little bit more dye, add a little bit more ice inside. So I just kind of rigged up a way to gravity dye this inside my dye space. I took a couple of the metal shelves that I use, placed them underneath the vinyl guttering, and I placed the whole entire setup down inside of a plastic tote. The shirt wasn't sitting on the bottom of the tote, but it was hanging over the edge down into the tote so that any of the extra dye runoff wasn't going to just go all over the place. With the indoor setup, I can't get quite as much space between the pieces of vinyl guttering, but I'm kind of pushing that shirt down in there to see if I can make it work. I'm going to go ahead and add some more dye to each one of these sinew lines. I don't have enough dye left to force more dye down through the shirt. So I'm going to apply a little bit more dye, soda ash, and some more ice. And then after that layer of ice melted, I figured that was probably about as good as I was going to get it. So I just left the shirt alone and I allowed it to process. I left it for probably about 24 to 48 hours before I rinsed it out. Before I start rinsing the shirt, you can see that the dye has finally gotten all the way out to the outer edges of the shirt really well. I started rinsing the shirt in cold water to rinse out the soda ash. After rinsing in cold for a while, I went ahead and warmed the water up to hot and continued rinsing in hot water to try to rinse out the excess dye that didn't bond with the fabric. I untied the shirt, and then instead of rinsing for a long time, I decided to go ahead and soak the shirt. And to do that, I placed some really hot water in my utility sink along with some Blue Dawn dish soap, placed the shirt inside, and just allowed it to soak. When the water cooled off, I changed it out, and I continued that soaking process until my water was remaining almost clear. Because I have a lot of blue on this shirt, it took quite a few rinses to get it to that point, or times of soaking the shirt. After my water was remaining almost clear, I placed the shirt along with some Dharma's professional textile detergent into my washing machine, and I washed it using a hot water cycle. Okay, so the shirt has been washed, dried, and ironed, and let's see what this experiment looks like. Okay, so what do you guys think? Because I'm really happy with it. I think it looks pretty cool. I honestly was a little concerned whether or not I was going to be able to get good saturation and any kind of color mixing in those center areas. You know, there just wasn't a whole lot of space between those lines, but I'm really happy with it. I got pretty good definition on my sinew lines, especially the first one. The green one is not too bad. The blue one, I do have some definition, but it's not fully white all down that line. I like the color splits though that are right on the line with the brilliant blue. I think that looks cool. And of course, Mindbender X, that's always a cool color. I knew some of the colors in Mindbender X, like the blues and the greens, I thought they would go really well with the two colors that I chose. And I'm not disappointed with that either. Same thing for the green. I think the forest green looks really pretty the way it flows down the shirt. In the past, I've had issues with greens not flowing quite as well, but it worked really well on this shirt. About the only thing that I am a little bit disappointed with is all of the mass speckling right around that center color, the Mindbender X. I think part of that is because my dye wasn't moving very fast. There are just several reasons, I think, for that. If I did this again, I would maybe use something other than the pieces of vinyl guttering, something not quite as wide, so that I had more space for the shirt to dip down in between and the dye to be able to flow and move. So that is on my list to try again and do just a few things a little different. But as far as the technique goes, I think it's really cool having these 3 different colors on the shirt and having them in kind of more defined areas. But what do you guys think? Do you like it? Do you like this technique? Do you think I ought to keep messing with it and see if I can maybe refine it a little bit more? Please drop me some comments down below and let me know. And if you've enjoyed the video, I sure would appreciate it if you would like it and if you'd subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you'll hit the bell, you'll receive a notification whenever I upload a new video. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.